Throughout history, there have been many brutal execution methods which were used to take the life of a condemned person. Some of these were aimed to strike fear into the hearts of people in the lands in which they were used. For example, the oubliette was a tiny prison cell in which a victim was simply left to rot and was forgotten. They could not sit down or stand up properly. They were usually locked into one position, and because of this it was very painful. The people held in the oubliettes would also rarely get fed, and they would have to contend with rats and other vermin who would slowly eat their flesh. The oubliette was horror, but there was another execution method which was known as immurement, in which someone was walled in and was then also forgotten about. But one of the most harrowing execution methods emerged from Mongolia, and it was rather straightforward in its use, but was completely horrific, and it earned the title the Box of Death. But what is the story of this? Join us today as we look at the Mongolian coffin, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Imprisoning someone inside of a tiny cage or a small cell is today considered inhumane, but it was used for centuries, and the Nazis would even use it during the Second World War, introducing standing cells to concentration camps such as Dachau and Auschwitz. But in Mongolia there was a prison known as the Urga, which became infamous for its levels of brutality, and the prisoners were given torture known as the Box of Death. Behind a fenced wooden enclosure in the prison was a small group of houses. Each of these was pitch black and nothing could be seen, and the houses were often freezing, but they did keep the inmates away from the blustery wind. But these houses, inside of them, had a number of wooden boxes and coffins that measured 4 feet long by 2 feet wide, and they were 1.5 feet tall. Around them were 15 feet high sharp timber palisades, and the boxes were so small that an inmate could not fit in them normally, but prisoners were forced into them, and they were locked inside these tight boxes. They could not sit up or lie, almost like the oubliette. For this reason they were said to be coffin prisons. Visitors to Mongolia and travellers would see these, and one American explorer said there was only one small hole in each box that hardly got any light in. Men would lose their eyesight, and their sanity also inside the boxes. The 6-inch holes in the boxes would feed the prisoners once a day, and their human excrement would be cleaned out every 2 or 3 weeks, and often the men would suffer from disease and dysentery, as well as burns from their waste. Some of the men were considered escapees, and they were chained around their necks to a pair of monocles that were placed around their hands, making the ordeal even worse. Inside of this small box would be hell, and prisoners would hope things would come to an end very soon. For those inmates who committed a less serious offence, the punishment of the prison cells and boxes would last a few weeks, but more serious prisoners would spend their whole prison stays inside of the boxes. As they were kept in this way for so long, their limbs would shrink and get smaller, and they would also waste away. Lots of these men were sentenced to death and would die inside of the coffins before their execution date came around, and many coffins were left in freezing cold conditions to bring death sooner, and many froze. The majority of those locked inside the death coffins were Chinese, as at the time the Chinese had invaded Mongolia and they had occupied a number of regions. One report would state, the prisons and dungeons of the far eastern country contain a number of refined Chinese, shut up for life in heavy iron-bound coffins, which do not permit them to sit upright or lie down. These prisoners see daylight for only a few minutes daily when food is thrown into their coffins through a small hole. One of the most infamous uses of the death coffin was noted when Albert Khan and Stefan Passé visited Mongolia. They would take a photograph of a woman who was condemned to a slow and painful starvation inside of the wooden crate. She was left in a remote desert and was simply dumped, but the box became her tomb. Around her were a number of bowls that to begin with had water in them, but they were not refilled, and the person inside had to beg for food, which only made her suffering much worse. The photographers had to leave the suffering woman to her death, as they would have been guilty of getting involved in the law and order of a different country, and could have been punished themselves for it. But the woman was clearly suffering, and some claim that the woman inside the box was sentenced to death for adultery, but this has been disputed. The death coffins of Mongolia were horrific and brutal execution and torture methods that were outlawed in the 1920s. Still today, Mongolian prisons are known for their harsh, brutal punishments, as prisoners are still often subjected to torture and are forgotten about. But the death coffin was an execution method similar to the oubliette and immurement, but it was completely evil and barbaric, and being locked inside a tiny box for a significant amount of time would be harrowing. The people inside would want death to take them quickly, so their ordeal could be over. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.